This is tape number 2, Rue Ziegler interviewing Mill Varrelman for the Jack Davies Agricultural Land Preservation Fund. And Mill, we were just talking about how different your experience was joining the Board of Supervisors from your previous experience on the St. Helena City Council. How could you just tell us how it was different?
Well, the land use, of course, is a broader issue, much more difficult issue because of the amount of dollars involved in land use decisions at the county level. Agriculture, the wine industry, when I went on the board in 1982, was still relatively in its infancy. I mean, there were some wineries in the county. Many of them were making money, but it hadn't risen to the level of notoriety that it is today. So there was a lot of pressure to develop Napa County in other directions. And that was the real big difference, was the amount of pressure because of the number of dollars that can be made in just turning a few acres of land into some other kind of development. I recall one conversation I had with a developer who said he would never develop in Napa County. He said, "I don't care what the price of land is in Napa County, it's cheap. And you can make a lot of money developing it." And he was a developer who had made a fortune. So this was somebody whose conversation I did not take lightly.
Was there still a lot of divisiveness about the ag preserve?
No, that was a set issue. People by that time had accepted the ag preserve. There were still hard feelings, I think, among some old timers. One of my neighbors on Kearney Street was Louis Strala, who had been the mayor of St. Helena at one time. And he had been a friend of Julius Caioca, who was the chairman of the Board of Supervisors. And when Julius voted for the ag preserve, those two men never spoke to each other again the rest of their lives. Both of them went to their grave, never saying another word to each other. It was as bitter a feud as I've ever seen, and it was because Julius basically voted the wrong way as far as Louis was concerned.
Oh, I didn't realize that they never had anything to do with each other after
Never
that.
again.
Were there other instances like that?
I'm sure, but I don't know of them specifically. That's one that I did know about. I knew both men fairly well. Knew Louis quite well and knew Julius quite well.
This developer that you were mentioning earlier, was he local or was he
Al Wilsey.
Oh, that was Al Wilsey.
Yes.
All right. And what were some of the first land use issues that you were presented with at the Board of Supervisors?
Well, when I went on the board, there was a big issue over what they called Vineyard Inn, which was going to go in north of Yountville. It was a fairly big development, and there was a lawsuit filed against the Board of Supervisors on that issue, basically saying that the general plan was not up to date, and therefore they couldn't move forward with it. And so that was the issue. But the lawsuit actually tied up the general plan for a couple of years, and there was not a lot of land use decisions that we could make because of the lawsuit.
Well, now Jim Hickey was now in the planning department at this point.
He was the planning director at the time.
He was the planning director, and did you have to? Was this a big learning curve for you?
Huge. It was huge. The board at the time was basically a 4-to-1 split on land use issues, and I was the one. It was 4 members against me, and they all supported the Grapevine Inn, not the Grapevine Inn, the Vineyard Inn, north of Yountville, and I would have opposed it, but the lawsuit tied that up. So several land use decisions that did come up during that period of time were generally decided on a 4-1 vote.
Did that make you very unpopular among your
colleagues?
Yes.
No, I don't know that it did. You know, it was kind of an interesting relationship. The had an experience. One of the supervisors was John McLogic from American Canyon, and Mickey, I think, had an 8th grade education, was a very unsophisticated man, and but had levels of intelligence, you know, that you had to recognize, and certainly was a very thoughtful and kind person.
How do you spell his name, just for the...
Excuse me, you want me to spell Czechoslovakia too? Mikologic. I'll have to come back to you on that one.
Sounds like Mikel something.
Yeah, M-I-K.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Mikologic, I guess.
The phonetics.
Yeah. Anyhow, there was one meeting, and I can't even remember what the issue was, and I really didn't say much at the meeting. I just made my points and voted no on the issue, and then went on the radio and just blasted the Board of Supervisors. I just unloaded on them big time. And at the next meeting, before the meeting, Mick Logic pulled me aside and he says, Mel, he says, I don't care how you vote or what you do, he says, but if you're going to say things, you should say them in this room and not at the radio station, where we at least have a chance to answer you. And I think that was probably singularly the most important lesson I ever had in learning to be a county supervisor. And that was to learning that there is a protocol you should follow, and that there is a respect that you should lend to your colleagues. And if you do that, then they will respect you in return. And so I never forgot that lesson, and still feel it was one of the most important political lessons I ever had in my life. And it was kind of interesting. So here's this fellow who's working on a master's degree, being trained by a fellow with an 8th grade education, and grateful that he did it, you know, because he really taught me a very important lesson. And so I think when I developed that, we developed those relationships, and they knew that they could disagree with me and that I would respect them for that disagreement if they were honest in their disagreement, if that's how they believed. Then we would get along. And as a matter of fact, 2 members of that board I was actually very fond of, and that was Mikologic and Harold Moskowitz.
And who were the other members of the board at that time?
Bill Chu and what's the other?
How do you spell Bill
Bob
Chu?
White.
Oh.
Chu. Bob White and Bill Chu.
C-H-E-W.
C-H-E-W. Bill had been a former city councilman. Bob White was elected at the same time I was. He and I were the rookie members.
And the board had been quite pro-development then.
It switched back and forth. Actually, in the 70s, it was not pro-development, and shifted in the 80s. 78 election, I think it took a shift that way, 3 members to 2 members, and then in the 82 election, 4-1. So it really shifted hard to the right, if you want to use that term, right-left. You know, I don't think that's an adequate term, but that would be at least one way of describing it.
And how did the Vineyard Inn issue get resolved?
Well, the board, by the time the lawsuit was finalized and the general plan could be brought up to date, there was a change in the board, and I think the developers walked away from it anyhow. They just saw this as a losing deal. I can't remember if it ever even came to a vote.
And now the ground was clear for preparation of a general plan?
Well, we actually updated the general plan during that period of time, and probably had the general plan updated somewhere in the neighborhood, somewhere about 84, 85, I guess. Somewhere. But also there was a board election in 84 that shifted the scope of the board, or the makeup of the board.
Now, I was going to ask you who your closest allies were when you first got involved. I know you said there was a change in the membership of the Board of Supervisors.
Change in the makeup in 1984. Kathleen McCullough, former mayor of Yountville, was elected, and she was on my side. And Jay Getting, who had been a news broadcaster in Napa, was elected, and he was on my side. So we've now had a 3-2 majority. And
big difference.
It was the difference, yeah. Then we started doing things. The general plan was behind us. The lawsuit was behind us. The first thing we took on was strip development up and down the highways, and actually turned a lot of potential commercial real estate up and down Highway 29, on Highway 121 going over toward Sonoma, a lot of the commercial development, we turned it back into ag land so that the commercial developments could not occur. We didn't take land that was developed, we took land that was undeveloped, and probably eliminated, I don't know how many parcels of potential development up and down the highways that would have changed the whole fabric of Napa County. I think that was probably an important decision that isn't really fully understood or recognized as for its value, because when you take something that isn't there and you don't let it happen, people don't notice it. And that's what that is. There was no development there. There was no development proposed. We just eliminated the possibility.
Was there resistance to this?
Of course. Yeah, no, we were taking lands that people had that owned, whether they, however they got the property, and taking away their right to develop it commercially, which probably reduced its value in their minds. In most cases, it was historically transferred within the family, so there was no loss in value to them. Their property was worth more than what it was when they bought it or got it, and so there was no loss in value in reality. It was just potential loss that they thought they had. The next big thing was 1985. We instructed the staff to develop the winery ordinance, the winery definition ordinance, which was probably as bloodletting an ordinance as the Ag Preserve. It was a brutal battle, and took 5 years.
5 years
5
from
years.
the time you
From the time
asked
we
the staff
introduced
to
it
first.
To the time we finally adopted it.
And how did the idea first come about?
It became apparent to me, and I know in conversations probably with Volker and with others, that winery development was in itself becoming problematic. The first step was, of course, eliminating strip development. Well, then we saw wineries coming in who could go in on an acre parcel, set up a building, sell t-shirts, glassware, and wine, and never produce a drop. So all of a sudden, this looks like a retail liquor store to me. And indeed, that's what they were. And the other thing that happened, I had a couple of fellows come in and tell me they wanted to build a brewery on Highway 29. And I told them that the industrial park was a great place for brewery, no problem. And they told me they liked the ambiance of Highway 29. Well, ambiance means tourist traffic going in front of the door. That's what that meant. But there's no relationship between a brewery and what we do here. Absolutely none. We don't grow any hops, so they would have imported all the raw material. So it was really an industrial complex in the ag areas, which didn't make any sense to me. So we introduced the idea of a winery ordinance to address these issues, and actually put it to a committee of vintners, growers, and farm people to help frame this thing. And that was probably the big mistake.
And why is that?
Well, I think we would have had an ordinance in about a year if the staff would have developed it. We would have argued it out in the boardroom and passed it over objection. As it was, it took the vintners and growers almost 5 years to come to resolution. The plus side of it is that almost all of the vintners and growers have bought into the winery ordinance. And there are some problematic parts of it that I presume somebody could take issue with, but nobody will because like I said, everybody bought into it. So the plus side is they bought into it. The negative side is that it took a long time to get there. 2 supervisors actually lost their jobs over it. They were defeated in 1988, and that was Kathleen and Jay. And Mickey was reelected. Who else was reelected?
So that was Kathleen
McCullough
and Jay.
Jay Getting were defeated in 1988, and Fred Negri and John McLogic were elected to the board.
And you weren't up for re-election
No, I was
at
not up for re-election.
At that point. But if it had been imposed from the outside, do you think that would have...
It's hard to say how that would have gone down. It would have gone down hard with some of the vintners. There's no question about it. Some of the vintners would have really been unhappy with it. There were vintners that were unhappy with the final result, period. So there would have been some hard feelings. So, like I said, the upside is that the vintners as a group, essentially bought into it. The downside is I think there's some weaknesses in the ordinance that could have been addressed, and weren't. There were some compromises made and that probably shouldn't have been made.
What would those be?
Oh, it had to do with food services and basically turning these places, some of them, into restaurants.
Uh-huh.
Rather than, a little bit broader than just a winery. A winery, in my view, is allowed in the ag preserve because it's an exception to the rule. The ag preserve is a place to grow grapes. The winery is an industrial complex that belongs to an industrial zone. So this is an exception to ag use. The fact of the matter is that it takes the raw materials from surrounding it, process it, and then produces a product. So it has a relationship to what's grown there, and that's the reason it's allowed as an exception to the rule. So and that's why the brewery didn't make any sense, is because it was not it was just an industrial complex. And most people don't think of a winery as an industrial complex, but that's indeed exactly what it is. And so they exist as an exception to the ag zoning. Some of the problems now with the winery ordinance, as far as I'm concerned, is that you can have a winery go into a plot of land in one end of the county, and they grow their grapes at the other end. So they're trucking this stuff up and down the county, which creates other kinds of problems for both the industry and the people that live here, and the whole atmosphere of the wine industry. And before I left the board, I was suggesting that we look at that as an issue and actually require new wineries to be able to grow their grapes on their own properties.
And so
which would have been a significant change.
So you're talking about a connection between the area where the
nexus,
grapes are manufactured into wine,
a nexus between
and
the winery and the stuff that's grown on the ground.
So now with the winery definition ordinance, for the record, if you could explain what
it does,
what that regulated.
Okay, basically the major changes were that the wineries were no longer allowed on an acre parcel, and they required a minimum of 10 acres to build a winery, which was a major change that took a lot of small parcels out of the mix for potential winery development. The next major change was that all new wineries coming in had to use 75% Napa County grapes for their product, which is huge when you think about it. So a winery comes in and they want to produce a Cabernet. 75% of their grapes have to come from Napa County, and that's a very restrictive relationship. It's also a problematic one, because there are maybe some trade issues that could come up under that. But most people, last time I had a conversation with leaders in industry, they seemed content with the idea that indeed the 75% rule was okay.
And how is there oversight to ensure that the 75% rule is adhered to?
They have to file reports with the Napa County Ag Department.
So when you were preparing, or your staff was preparing the winery definition ordinance, who was most helpful to you in terms of sort of fleshing out this issue?
Oh, probably Volker, more than anybody else. And there were so many people that talked to you on these issues. It's hard to identify one individual, but Volker was certainly crucial because he and I saw eye to eye on a lot of things, and he was able to keep me informed on what was going on in the conversations between the vintners and the growers. But I would hear lots of things from lots of different people.
Among the vintners, who were the most receptive to the idea?
Oh boy, I'm not sure there were many that were. They took a very hard line on it. As a matter of fact, the 1988 election, if you will, shows just exactly how set in stone they were on this issue. They held a huge meeting down at the Marriott in Napa, and the meeting was to introduce prospective board members and board members who are up for re-election to the vintners and discuss the issues before them. And the whole thing was a setup to basically promote their candidates, which were the two that were opposing the incumbents. And that's exactly how it worked. And it was actually set up by a couple of the major vintners, and they John Mikologic, interestingly enough, was not there, but he didn't have to be, because they weren't interested in hearing what he had to say. They were interested in basically setting up McCullough and getting for defeat, and they were able to do that. In a sort of a backroom way, I told the vintners that this was not a good idea for them to get into supervisorial politics on a 2-year basis, because they have to then start winning every 2 years, because when they lose, it will devastate their industry. And they're better off not playing the supervisor's game. And that was the last year they did it, actually. They pulled away from that. I think they understood that that's not necessarily a good idea to go out front on supervisors' elections, because, like I told them, their industry is on the table every time they do that. And this is not what's good for us, not good for Napa County, and not good for them.
And now, when did the winery definition ordinance finally pass?
It was about 1990. I think Paul Battisti had been elected then, defeated Harold Moskowite, and we passed it then. I believe it was then it was passed.
And now I want to go back just a little bit in time, because I wanted to ask you, when you first got involved with land use issues, were you familiar with the Williamson Act?
The Williamson Act? A little bit. The Williamson Act's fairly complicated. It's a tax program more than anything else. And it's a fairly complex set of rules. Probably John Tudor is the most versed individual in Napa County on that. And he was versed even before he became the assessor. That has always been one of his strongest issues. So I have some understanding of the Williamson Act.
But the Williamson Act is just sort of case by case and doesn't actually.
Yeah, it actually in a lot of cases, a lot of properties don't often opt into the Williamson Act, because they actually it doesn't do that much for them. The Williamson Act actually works better for marginal farms that aren't highly successful, that make a lot of money,
where farmers get a lower tax rate,
tax rate
based on the production of the farm rather than the marketable value of the land.
Yeah, and you eliminate any ability to change uses. You give up ability to change uses.
But only for 10 years, is that?
Yeah, but you have to opt out of it. You have to elect out of it. Otherwise it keeps rolling over. And so it takes a while to do this. And so it's actually a long time frame for somebody to make that decision. So I think a lot of farmers, if they're making a lot of money on their properties, they aren't necessarily that